our study today, we'll be looking at the question, should all SDA ministries be under the conference? Now, this question was asked because of some statements that was made by Pastor Ted Wilson and the leadership in the last General Conference spring meeting. Here is what was said.
I'm going to be asking Mark Finley and Mike Ryan to share with us the marvelous emphasis on what benefits can come with our supporting ministries, working closely with the world church. And I want to thank Divisions for embracing our Adventist Layman Services and Industries, ASI, and OCI, Outpost Centers International, and other entities that are co-laborers with us, but separate legally, and we have to be careful about the legal aspects of this as well, because we are two different entities, let's say, working together with a common mission. But there are organizations that are called independent ministries, and you can find a great variety of them all over the world. People who simply have their own ideas, they want to push an agenda, and they don't really want to work closely with the church. They think they are either more purified than the church, or they don't need the church, or whatever it is. I don't know what their reasons are. And then you find many organizations that are supporting ministries. They work closely. Again, let me underscore the need to make sure that we have good distinctions legally between different organizations and the church itself, but we cooperate well with these wonderful groups of people.
Those who work closely with the conference, he calls them supportive ministries. And those who are not working with the conference, he calls them independent ministries. This is what the leaderships have decided. They have made a distinction between supportive ministries and independent ministries. What Pastor Wilson is saying is that if you want to work with the SDA church, you need to be under the conference or the general conference. That's why we're studying this thing today, because we want to know, should all SDA ministry need to be under the general conference in order to work for the SDA church? So I had to go to the Spirit of Prophecy to see what God have to say about this subject, because many of our leaders, they make decisions over and over again, and they end up making wrong decisions because they do not seek God's counsel on these things. So this is what the Lord had to say about it. There are to be thousands at work in the cities, laboring intelligently. Not all these workers should look to the conference for support. They should seek to make their work self-supporting. A great many can do self-supporting work, but some cannot. Ellen White is saying that some can do self-supporting work and some cannot. Some can look to the conference for help, and some ministries can do self-supporting work. You can see that it is not God's will that all ministries should look to the conference for support or financial aid, but he's calling some to do self-supporting work. So let's continue. Let's see what else he has to say. The Lord has instructed me that from the first, the work in Huntsville and Madison should have received adequate help. But instead of this help being rendered promptly, there has been a long delay. And in the matter of the Madison School, there has been a standing off from them because they were not under the ownership and control of the conference. So Ellen White is saying that a work was being done in Huntsville and Madison, and they needed help. But because this work was not under the control and ownership of the conference, there was a long delay. She continues saying, this is a question that should sometimes be considered, but it is not the Lord's plan that means should be withheld from Madison because they are not bound to the conference. So Ellen White is saying that even though the Madison School was not under the conference, that the conference should financially support it. This is interesting. She continues saying the attitude which some of our brethren have assumed towards this enterprise show that it is not wise for every working agency to be under the dictation of conference officers. Let me read that again. It says the attitude which some of our brethren have assumed towards this enterprise shows that it is not wise for every working agencies to be under the dictation of conference officers. There are some enterprises under certain conditions that will produce better results if standing alone. So, this counsel is clear that even though this work was not under the ownership and control of the conference, Ellen White was still saying that they needed financial support, and it is God's will that it should be this way. She says, not every working agency to be under the dictation of conference officers. This is so plain. I don't think anyone can misunderstand this. When my advice was asked in reference to the Madison School, I said, remain as you are. There is danger in binding every working agency under the dictation of the conference. The Lord did not design that this should be. Let me read that again. It says, the Lord did not design that this should be. The circumstances were such that the burden bearers in the Madison School could not bind up their work with the conference. So here it is again. We can see that it is not God's will that all SDA ministries should be under the control and ownership of the conference or general conference. It is God's will that some should be under the conference and some should not be under the conference. She says, I knew their situation, and when many of the leading men in our conferences ignored them because they did not place their school under conference dictatorship, I was shown that they would not be helped by making themselves amendable to the conference. They had better remain as led by God, amendable to Him, to work out His plans, but this matter need not be ablaze abroad. So it is very clear that not all SDA ministries or self-supported work should be under the control of the conference in order for us to work with the church. We can be independent and still work for God's church. We can clearly see that the counsel that is coming out of the General Conference is not in harmony with God's instructions. And as God's people, we need to be very careful who we're listening to. Should we listen to God's counsel or should we listen to the counsels of man? Here we can clearly see that Pastor Ted Wilson and the leadership, they're not being led by God because they're asking us to do something that God clearly states this is not according to His will. It didn't take me long to find these quotes. And, these leaders have access to these quotes. But many of them didn't take the time to sit down and search these things before they bring it to God's people. And this is why they keep making these mistakes over and over again. Set aside in God's counsel to encourage members to follow their own ideas. Jesus had a ministry, and His ministry was not under the conference or the general conference of His day. Would Jesus' ministry be looked at as not working with the church? I call upon the general conference to leave these ministries alone. Leave the independent ministries alone. Leave them alone and follow God's will. It is not God's will that all ministries should be under the conference. Jesus had an independent ministry. Independent ministries are doing a good work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Those that are under the conference, and those are outside of the conference. They're leading many souls to Christ. And many of these people, when they're baptized, they join the Seventh day Adventist Church just as a supporting ministry. So I see the wisdom in God allowing some ministries to be under the conference and some ministries to be outside of the conference. This keeps the church in check. And man, isn't God's counsel